We did issue some very strong statements about this legislation. They were always along the lines of, it's very burdensome and we want you to fix and reduce the burden. We never said we hereby oppose the bill. And I just wanted that to be clear. But
let the Chamber of Commerce do that.
Well, since we're not members of the Chamber of Commerce, they speak for themselves under the First Amendment. And a lot of people were exercising their rights under the First Amendment during the pendency of this bill. There were an awful lot of complaints about that. But in any case, the question was whether there's a unique burden. And I think in working with my colleagues in the financial services industry who preferred to work behind the scenes, we didn't prefer to work behind the scenes, and sometimes that was to our benefit and sometimes it was to our detriment. But in any case, I think we had some good success. I think our interests were really identical because our members issue credit cards, and the primary burden on the credit card companies really is at the Visa and MasterCard level because it's really up to them to process the payments regardless of whether the card's issued by Bank of America or whether it's the First National Bank or Podunk or wherever. And in terms of checking and these electronic transactions, the processes at the small banks and the large banks are pretty similar. You have to automate these systems. Of course, the electronic systems are by definition automated, and they again run through systems that are really outside the bank. And I don't think a big bank would have any easier time going through individual checks to see if someone was foolish enough to write payable to Joe's illegal internet gambling site. I mean, no bank, small or large, could possibly do that. It's just beyond comprehension. So I don't think there's any particular difference between small banks. I think we may have presented a little more sympathetic case, and Congressman Goodlatte was good enough to not only to listen to our witnesses' testimony at the House Judiciary Committee, but come back and address our concerns and work with us on our concerns. And of course, Mr. Leach, a long-time supporter of community banks. Iowa has probably got more community banks per square county than anybody else. So we had good support, and politically sometimes that's a little more effective. Bank of America comes in. You don't get too many violins out for B of A when they come in and ask for something, no matter how meritorious it might be.
Thanks. Anybody has questions? I think this microphone, I'm not aware, that's the one for people to come and ask any questions. Does anybody have anything at this particular moment?
I need to come to the microphone or speak here?
If you could speak loud enough, I think.
Sure.
We're on TV.
Actually, yeah, if we
If you want to be downloaded on iTunes, you got to probably need a microphone.
Well, just in full disclosure for Michael, I work with the Poker Players Alliance, and your boss has been great. We've been able to sit down and meet with him, and he heard our views, and we really appreciate the opportunity to meet with him on this issue. We've been very vocal in opposing this legislation and looking towards regulation instead of prohibition. And a couple of the issues that you raised as a problem with internet gambling, money laundering, problem gambling, etc. The issues that were raised by Human was that the third-party banks are going to kind of spring up overseas where people will then funnel their money through that. Won't that create a larger problem for money laundering than what is either currently going through U.S. banks or U.S. debits, or if we actually regulate the system and have it more transparent where U.S. banks were actively engaged and it was more, a more transparent system?
I was pretty stunned to hear the suggestion that somehow these third-party payment systems weren't envisioned or aren't included in this bill, because they were absolutely considered every step of the way and have been, without question, included. It was absolutely our intent and we believe absolutely effective the bill, that a credit card company or a bank will be, under the regulations that will be prescribed, I believe, we hope July 13th, they will be forced to identify and block a restricted transaction to any internet casino or facilitator of internet gambling. And that would include a third-party payment system that's funneling money to one of those casinos. We always, through this process, use the example of NetTeller. NetTeller is an offshore payment site, as many of you probably know, that derives approximately, and this is very much a ballpark, 80% of their revenue from internet gambling, and 20% of it from pornography. It's just a tidbit. But for NetTeller to continue to have U.S. customers, we envision that what NetTeller would likely have to do is essentially create NetTeller 1 and NetTeller 2. NetTeller 1 would be used for internet gambling, and NetTeller 2 for everything else. And NetTeller 1 would be blocked. A U.S. citizen or someone with a U.S. bank account would be blocked from interacting with NetTeller 1, but not from NetTeller 2. And so you can continue to buy, pornography or whatever else through NetTeller 2. But certainly we envision the bill as the Federal Reserve and Treasury, when they prescribe regulations, will include these third-party payment sites.
This one's from Michael also. You mentioned that the pornography, a lot of that comes from NetTeller. You mentioned also that this law had moral underpinnings, supposedly. What's the justification for prohibiting rather than regulating gambling, but regulating pornography? Since pornography seems like it has the same potential to ruin families and whatnot.
Certainly dealing with that was beyond the scope of what we were trying to do. That was never our intent to deal with pornography in any way. But it's a really good question. Where do you draw the line? Can you, and that gets to a question that we dealt with a lot through this process. A lot of people suggested that the internet is just too big. You'll never be able to prevent some internet casino from popping up. You'll never be able to do it. And I would suggest that that's not necessarily the case. I think the problem here is really one where you have to make a choice. If you're able to regulate, that means you also still have to be able to block those other casinos that aren't regulated. So you have to have a mechanism to prevent transactions that go to those casinos that are somehow going to be outside the scope of the law. And if you're going to regulate, that means all of the internet casinos have to exist in the United States, because that's the only way they'll be within jurisdiction of the U.S. Justice Department. So you have these casinos, let's say you have MGM Grand and Harrah's operating a casino, an internet casino in the United States, and it's regulated. You protect problem gamblers, kids. You don't allow credit card pop-ups on the website to come up after you've maxed out your credit card. All of those things. But what do you do about the bodog that exists? And bodog is just an example, but that exists offshore, that allows a 16-year-old to somehow get online and bet with their parents' credit cards. How do you do it? So you have to have one. You have to have a mechanism that blocks out these transactions to some degree. So I would suggest the issue you're asking about isn't one really for this law. We don't change what the law is. The law is the internet gambling is illegal. The problem was the law wasn't being enforced. And so how do you enforce the law? Well, you had to cut off. You couldn't do it through the Justice Department. You couldn't do it through injunctive remedies or criminal penalties. So you had to come up with a different mechanism. And we came up with a system to cut off the money. When you deal with the regulations, you cut off the lifeblood of these casinos. You're going to have to do it somehow. Because if you're going to regulate or allow some online casinos to exist, by implication, it means you have to prevent some other casinos from existing. And so we've just come up with a mechanism that prevents all internet casinos from existing or having access to the U.S. market. And someone down the road, Mr. Leaf won't be in the Congress, certainly there are some, but someone down the road might try to introduce something like internet gambling. And I think that down the road, that's a judgment that people can make, but they're still going to have to be able to enforce the law against those companies that aren't regulated. We think this is an effective mechanism.
I think I'd like to put a similar question to the other two panelists in that it's a question of imperfect enforcement. Sure, you could possibly, there's a way to channel it through 18 different intermediaries, but as we saw from the immediate effect of the bill, there were some sites that lost a dramatic amount of market share, or excuse me, stock value, because of the bill's passage. And is that not a good result in the sense that this was an illegal activity? And it is a question of enforcement. These companies had prospectuses that said, and on the London Exchange, a majority of our profits come from the United States where it is illegal. Isn't that a good result, and isn't that sufficient to justify some sort of enforcement mechanism such as this?
Well, from the perspective of the drafters of the statute, I mean, certainly that would be the case, at least initially, but I think there still is a big problem with not so much the net tellers of the world, because those can be blocked when the regulations come down. Net teller is a big target, we all know about that. But how about the next net teller, the next company that's smaller, it's private, it's underground, and people just put the money there? I still haven't, in my mind, at least, for a satisfactory answer as to how you're going to prescribe money from going to those types of organizations. So the effect here is an effective prohibitionism with all the attendant consequences of that in driving an activity between consenting adults underground and the criminality that arises from that, the opacity between the company and the debtor, what have you. I don't think it's really an issue of good enforcement, because I don't think enforcement is really going to be too effective in the long run, or will be effective in the long run. Is the ability of third-party offshore companies that are not in existence today, but that will soon arise in response to problem opportunities to fill a very large demand in the market, namely American market, namely for internet gambling. And just on one point, internet gambling has actually not been found to be legal under United States law. That is simply the interpretation of the Department of Justice. Actually, in 2001, Henry MasterCard International, the Eastern District of Louisiana, expressly found, through, in my opinion, quite solid legal reasoning, that only internet sports gambling, sports betting, is legal for a company to do, and that internet poker and those types of games are not illegal over the internet. That is simply a posture that the government takes, and it's certainly reasonable, but it's not the one that's been imported by any court, and certainly not the Supreme Court in the States.
Well, one of the problems we have, we sure don't want to have to decide as banks what's legal and illegal in terms of internet gambling. That's way beyond our expertise. I think the immediate effects were more kind of enforcement via publicity. You had some publicly traded companies that just didn't want to be seen to be attempting to circumvent U.S. law, and so they shut down. Our concern really, and if every internet gambling site went out of business, they finally saw the light to realize how foolish their activity was, that'd be fine with us. It's certainly not an activity our bankers encourage among their customers. Our only concern really is that the payment system, the check and the electronic system, just isn't configured and really can't, in a practical sense, be configured to effectively track and block these transactions. It sounds easy. It's easy to say those words, but oh well, you know, they can just track and block, but it just doesn't. It just can't happen. And so, if there's some other way to enforce this that's effective, either moral suasion or publicity, or you just scare the hell out of people, that's fine. It's all right with us. We were cautioned, frankly, we were urged by the incoming chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, don't go along with this bill because you know you're going to be the enforcement. The monkey's going to be on your back, and we did not oppose the bill. It's usually a good idea to take Mr. Frank's advice, but in this case we did not. And I think we can live with the bill as it panned out, and whether it's effective or not, we can't judge. We're not going to draw a roadmap for people who want to try to get around it. We just don't want it to burden the payment system because we want people to be able to, make those payments so they can pay their electric bill and buy the groceries, and all the rest of the things that have to go on through the payment system. That's our interest. That's the beginning of our interest and the end of our interest in this particular legislation.
Are there any other questions out there? I mean, how are we looking on time?
Hi, I'm a first-year law student here, and I happen to be a member of the Poker Players Alliance. Glad to see they're here today. My question is, what's the next step? Will the groups that are behind this bill, whether it's genuinely effective in stemming internet gambling, or whether it ends up being rather toothless, we kind of heard both sides. I mean, will the groups that are behind this be satisfied in the moral victory of getting the bill passed, or is there going to be an attempt to maybe bring enforcement down to the level of people who are actually playing? Is there going to be an effort for the banks to maybe put restrictions on people's accounts who are exercising or who are making these transactions if they're having trouble determining where these transactions are going? Just curious about what the next steps are.
I'll tell you, there was absolutely no appetite, no interest from any member of Congress. Well, there were a couple of members of Congress, but the vast, overwhelming majority of members of Congress have no interest in going after individual gamblers. None. Absolutely none. So you can rest easy that the government's not coming after you if you aggressively try to evade the law. You can follow up, sure.
Well, I'm not saying I can't rest easy. Some people can't rest easy because of concerns that currently NetTeller, for example, is a very reliable and safe and payment service, so I'm told. Major poker websites advertise on TV. They pay out. They pay out what people are owed. People depend on their their honesty, and so there's a concern that there's NetTeller 1 and NetTeller 2. Well, maybe those won't work. I mean, your example that's how NetTeller is going to deal with this presumes that NetTeller is going to want to comply with you. Now, if they start making hundreds of variations that the banks can't track, it just opens it up for fraud. If other people step in, if NetTeller steps out of the industry, they may not be as trusted. The websites now that are overseas, they have protections. You can't deposit a whole lot of money all at once if you've lost a bunch recently. They do these things voluntarily, and if they were in the country and regulated, they could be asked to do more. But by driving this underground, players cannot rest easy. It probably will discourage some people from playing, which I guess is the goal. But many of them don't really think it's such a bad thing to play. So I don't know. I mean, but anyway, I digress. I mean, back to the next steps.
Well, certainly the next step are the regulations that are being promulgated, and then it's hard to predict exactly what's going to happen. I would assume that the bigger companies like NetTeller, they would stop processing transactions from American banks, just to be on the safe side, if not just simply because people will stop sending funds to NetTeller. But what will happen after that is that new, probably very shady companies might pop up, or at least not as safe, not as regular as NetTeller, and then the problems with that will come along. I also don't see anybody being prosecuted, especially by the federal government, for individual gamblers being prosecuted. And the problem is, though, if someone wants to fulfill an appetite for gambling, I haven't seen any study that says internet gambling is any worse than gambling in-house, or, for that matter, gambling in state lotteries. State lotteries are pretty notorious for having the worst odds in terms of, and the worst sort of social effects in terms of who actually uses them. In fact, online gambling sites, because they have lower overhead, like poker sites, and because they do have some level of skill involved, if not a lot, they actually tend to have higher rates of return for individuals. In addition to the fact that if you are a professional poker player, it is a zero-sum game. It is a zero-sum game. For every win, there's a loss on the other side. However, if you play, for example, professionally, every day, consistently, and some casual players, they lose to you, what you're doing is you're creating a living for yourself, while casual players are losing a little bit of money in recreation. So in that sense, it is economically efficient and well-paying act as opposed to state lottery or something like that.
I would add, it's possible from a reading of this particular statute that, in fact, state lotteries also, if they have an internet component, they might fall underneath the certain regulations and the way the statute is written. It's a possibility at least.
Just one next steps. Another thing in addition to the regulation is to watch your papers to see whether some prosecutor tries to get an injunction for some reason outside of the statute against banks and other providers. We're hoping that doesn't happen, but that's something to watch for.
This actually is an interesting point you just raised, the question of internet lotteries. This was a central debate on, and it truly went on from this. How do you deal with it? We wanted no betting online. We wanted no carve-outs, no exceptions to betting online. And the question is, can a state lottery offer lottery tickets via computer? And in the legislative history, it's explicit that shall not occur. And it was something that was interesting. It was a person who was involved in this process, in this legislative process, was a Memorial Day picnic, and was taught. Someone asked her, so what have you been working on? He said, internet gambling. Work on this bill. And he said, well, you can buy a lottery ticket online, which was shocking. How can you do that? I've never seen that. Well, in the state of Virginia, you can. But it was sufficient, as long as you had a Virginia driver's license that said you were over 18, you would have been able to buy a lottery ticket online from Virginia, only Virginians. However, we added something that's very precise. There has to be sufficient age and location verification. So not really, Virginia's law was about age and residency verification. And currently the technology on the internet, you can't with certainty verify your age or your location. What computer? I could be sitting at my desk in Washington. It doesn't know where I am. And so we believe, at least at this point, that online lotteries is.
I do think as a practical matter, though, your kind of forecast is correct. You probably will see a lot of the larger corporations take significant hits, and you probably will end up with maybe a number of smaller groups and organizations that are kind of shadowy, or it's much more difficult to target them. I think the overall effect of that would be to drive out a lot of the casual users, because unless you're a very serious user, it'd be very hard, at least from my perspective, to go and sign up my credit card number for some unknown organization I've never heard of from the state of Estonia or anywhere else. So I think that is I think that could be a legitimate and intended effect of the bill, regardless of the fact that if you are determined, you probably will be able to get access to internet gambling. But again, it's a question of, have you ever caught all the fish in a single pond? I think the effect will be to do a lot, I think.
Well, certainly the standard, it's not fair, because the standard is not perfect enforcement. That's not fair to the draft of the whole statute. But if you're only going to drive away the casual user, I thought the real issue here was a hardcore, addicted gambler who will do anything and open up an account in Kazakhstan and to gamble. So.
Unless there's any other really pressing questions, I might end it on more of a lighthearted question. You brought up the suggestion that there's some games out there that could be considered games of skill rather than a chance. And so I'd just like to put the question to you. Texas Hold'em poker, in your opinion, is that sufficiently a game of skill, or is there some chance involved? I would just say, unless you have a royal flush, it would seem that there's always a chance that you could lose anything, and therefore it would be chance. But Pretty good.
I actually don't know the specific rules of Texas Hold'em poker, but there's certainly a chance involved in any act, and including any sports act. But there's also, I do believe, I have played poker enough, which is not that much, but enough to know that there's quite a bit of skill involved. And there's reason there's tournaments, and there's reason people persist in their performance and win over successive periods. And it must be due to skill as opposed to luck, which the luck is by definition randomly distributed throughout the universe. So I would say that at least a significant amount of skill involved.
All right, I think the final word for everybody would be appropriate.
Personal experience, I don't play poker, but my father was a police court judge in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and once threw out a case against poker players sitting around somebody's living room on the grounds that it was a game of skill and not a game of chance. The good burghers of Grand Rapids, Michigan were not pleased with his decision, but it was his decision.
I'll just say, I ran track in college. Every time I got hit, track is probably the sport where there's the least bit of chance or luck involved, especially when you're experienced. Either you win or you lose. On any given day, you're faster or you're slower. It's not a ball was tipped or you call an extra timeout. Other factors are involved, either you winning or losing. And the question of Texas Hold'em, is it a game of skill or is it a game of chance, is a tricky one. But I would say that the people who argue that it's a game of skill are taking this down a very dark route. They shouldn't probably want to take it. We generally think of sports as games of skill. All in basketball, a game of skill. And all of these games are defined not as they're games with their games of skill are generally considered sport. I think that the poker players, the more they continue to suggest that Texas Hold'em is a game of skill, the closer they get to considering to creating a definition of poker as a sport. And a sport that all people would say are covered by the 1961 Wire Act. Texas Hold'em is going to be included in the Wire Act as well. And so I think it's a pretty dangerous argument to make.
Yeah, I think the bill's pretty broad in terms of covering poker and anything else. So I mean that's an interesting distinction under a different law.
Unless there's any other final words or any final questions from anybody, I think it's be appropriate to close. Just as a final aside, in case you're interested in reviewing any or looking into this yourself, the particular law we're talking about is Public Law 109-347, and the Wire Act that is referred to here, in part, it is encapsulated in 18 U.S.C. 1084. And I'd also suggest going to the National Gambling Impact Study Commission website. I think you can type that in, it's fairly easy to find. And they have a very voluminous report laying out a lot of details. And unless there's anything else, I think it's...
Gavin as our moderator, and all of the distinguished panelists for coming out tonight. And thank everyone. As I said, this will be available online approximately within a week from our website, which can be found through the George Mason website. So thank you from the Journal of Law, Economics, and Policy for all those attending and all those participating.